afternoon to all my friends. If you are in this time zone, or if not, good day, good night. I'm very happy to be actually back in this SIAS event in part of the corporate governance week again. And as Pauline very aptly pointed out, this is a biennial study that we have done on the business integrity report, and this is something which I believe will be very important. In fact, even the words business integrity, a lot of people tell me, is it even an oxymoron? I mean, a business inherently or prepared or poised to be, having integrity, or is it something that we normally expect from businesses? And I say emphatically, it is definitely yes, because if you look from the SIAS angle, from an investor angle, it is the very least that we can do to expect the very most from the range of companies, which is actually the investor entities we want. So for this presentation, which is quite short, I'm going to just go straight to the point because after this, we have a very illustrious panel of experts, including, I would say, prominent lawyers who are, who will be able to dissect, look at many of issues. In fact, even I will join as a panelist. I expect to be even interrogated or maybe even prosecuted for some of the findings, because I'm actually going to share something that may be quite revealing in the context. But I should say very, very upfront that as investors, I think information is very important. Information is the key starting point, and it is precisely because of this we want to value disclosure, because I believe SIAS, under the able leadership of Mr. David Gerard and the team, has been urging companies to share as much as possible about what they do. In also we have done conducted and under the, I would say, support leadership of SIAS, together with my center, NUS Center for Governance and Sustainability, and also with another partner, because it's an ASEAN study. Over the years, we have roped in ASEAN CSR network to be part of the team to conduct the research. So this is something we do often, once every 2 years. Is a biennial study. Let me just go straight to what we have done. We look at 13 areas, which based on the research design, we cover as a vanguard of each ASEAN jurisdiction, 5 ASEAN countries, that the major one that has many companies listed, that have quite a lot of, I would say, involvement in terms of the investment market. So we look at all the sources, including annual reports, corporate governance reports, sustainability reports, website, and even media coverage. And we look at in the next slide, you can see 13 aspects of anti-corruption. 13 aspects, which is actually, I would say, this is actually benchmarked on based on the Transparency International, which is a Berlin-based organization that has been famous for the yearly corruption perception index of countries, and Singapore actually does very well. So we benchmark against one of their study, and over the years they have developed 13 aspects. You can see here in brief. I have categorized them, even though the categorization is not done by Transparency International. We have put it in terms of 3 categories of factors, and many of these factors have actually questions are indicated by many set of data that we have collected. I'll come to the data collection later, but you can see the 3 categories. Internal commitment, meaning something that comes from the organization. In other words, the leadership, the commitment of the company to comply their publicly frame statement towards anti-corruption, or even the statement on their zero tolerance, and also some of the things that pertains to certain codes, explicit code codified to involve employees, directors, training program, but very importantly, you can see the word leadership is actually right in the heart of this internal commitment. So this is one area we have looked at. The other aspect, the other category is external commitment, and this is something a little bit more sensitive in many organizations, and sometimes they do not want to say too much for some reason, but basically it is something outside the boundary of a company, that's something that pertains to third parties, to agents, to supplier, and mostly it will involve things like very sensitive. We'll talk about it in the panel, gift, hospitality support, in terms of the travel incentives, in terms of even so-called facilitation payment to make sure business happen, and also very importantly, political contribution in some countries are something that is normally quite seen in the landscape. And then the third category is reporting and monitoring, and I think this will involve things like whistleblowing, which is something that is picked up in many countries, including Singapore for listed company. And then things like, if you blow the whistle, what kind of retaliation, or even, what kind of resistance you will get from affected party, or even sometimes from the organization itself. They might ostracize or not see reporters, whistleblower favorably. And of course, the regular monitoring. So we can see these three aspects. This is really the heart of it all. And I must say, upfront, very importantly, because we are going to deal with this in the panel discussion. The whole study is just a first step. It is based on disclosure. It is based on the information provided by the company. And of course, I and the whole research team, and including even the organization that promulgated this whole stream of work, Transparency International, do recognize that disclosure is not the end of it all. It is just a starting point. It's just a starting point. And the end point is, of course, full enforcement, full realization of many of the practices, which are a little bit difficult to measure, but that's the end point. But to reach the end point, we need a starting point. So the starting point is very important. The fully enforced circumstance and situation will not be possible without even good information. In fact, SIAS, for SIAS itself, for investors themselves, we rely a lot on company information as a good basis to begin even the investigation work for whether an investment, a company, an entity is worthy even for initial consideration, initial screening. So this is something based on disclosure, and I hope the panel will extend this to see what are the challenges in terms of practices, in terms of enforcement, in terms of action. Why is there a gap seemingly between enforcement and disclosure? So let's look at disclosure first. And of course, every report, this is the top 9 findings in terms of just the amount of information that the top 50 companies by market cap give in each of the 5 ASEAN countries. This is the results in the biennial study over the last 6 years, from 2018, 6 years, that means 3 studies, to 2022, interval of 2 years each. So you can see over the years, companies in 2 countries are particularly strong in the disclosure, Thailand and Malaysia. And later we probably need to discover the reason why. It is not a reflection of any country at all as a whole in terms of national standing, but it's actually a reflection on the amount of information that companies give to their investors. And you can see probably it's contextualized to each of the country. For example, in Malaysia and Thailand, the urge for companies and also the expectations from investors are very high probably because of higher level happenings at the country level that necessitate companies to take even extra steps to assure investors that such things are done. And I would say for countries in the middle, such as Singapore, I think even though as a country, the nation does very well in surveys and in studies, in terms of company disclosure as a start, it does not mean that there's nothing in action, but as a start, I would say that there's a certain sense of reticence or even reluctance to give certain information, or maybe, and I say this is something probably quite true, things are perhaps taken for as given, because sometimes it's quite obvious certain things should not happen, but it's all the more good to be explicit about certain things in anti-corruption and bribery, because sometimes in the maybe in a clean regime, there's no need to talk too much. But again, in the ASEAN course of things and in the international study, it is good to do all the disclosure. So let's look at the first aspect. Two charts, internal commitment generally is quite high. This is in fact something quite assuring for at least across the board. Let's not compare countries. Across the board, it is generally very high. Relatively, in terms of leadership, in terms of having coach training program, compliance commitment programs, but you can see actually stronger country would be like Malaysia, perhaps Thailand, in terms of internal commitment disclosure. Okay, let's look at external across the board, without looking at individual companies. Generally, this is something companies usually are more reluctant to disclose, and it does not actually mean that they don't have such policy, but at least at the information level to assure stakeholders, many companies don't say too much about facilitation payment. According to the international methodology, you don't say too much about suppliers, agents. So across the board, it is actually significantly lower than internal. You can see certain countries, again, Malaysia and Thailand are a little bit more disciplined than the rest in terms of trying to cover external agents. So with that, the third category is reporting and monitoring. Again, this is like the internal. It's quite reassuring that it is something very high. In fact, 4 countries are quite close in terms of the level of disclosure. I would say, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand are actually quite, I would say, forthcoming in terms of programmatic information. Indonesia actually dropped a lot because maybe in the last round that there was a sense of, I would say, retrogression and even reluctance to review. For example, they don't disclose a lot of monitoring practices. Not sure why, but actually it did happen according to the assessor, my team of assessor who have done it over the years. We discern a little bit of downgrading a little bit. So let's look at specific aspect of the disclosure, and I think this may be something that would be good ingredients, for our panel discussion. Look at leadership support. I think again, it's quite obvious leadership should set the right tone, and even for that, you can sense that across the board, many companies did not give details on how leadership has demonstrated their commitment in terms of the specificity of the action. In many countries, I would say even for Singapore, it is taken as given, taken for granted. Sometimes in certain jurisdiction, I can sense a certain level of, I would say even complacency. It's just not given. Okay, let's look at another specific aspect, and I think this might be good ammunition for further discussion, and I think it's very good. The code of conduct is something that is always there. anti-corruption policy code. In fact, for very, very interestingly, in Malaysia, every company in the whole sample of large company has a code, but not all for the other countries. I think at least it should spell out certain things, even if you can say sometimes it may be a bit rhetorical. Action cannot start if there's no words to begin with. And of course, the next gap, we can actually as a panel discuss how authorities, how agencies in each country can bridge the gap between disclosure and practice. I think that this is something that would be not possible for any team to go into deep into the company to ascertain the veracity, the authenticity of many of the disclosure. But of course, if it's something disclosed and if stakeholders, including shareholders, find out that there's a gross misrepresentation or even sometimes fraudulent disclosure, I mean, anytime the companies can be taken to the court, that it can be as serious as a criminal offense or even just simple issues under the Misrepresentation Act. So I think there are lawyers in our panel who can elaborate on this. Okay, let's look at external parties. Anti-corruption policy applied to persons who are not employees, usually called the agents. This is just an agent. You can see it's a mixed bag. Again, two countries stand up in terms of their coverage. I think Singapore probably need a little bit more forthcoming in this, even though it may not be a real problem. Give hospitality expenses. I think more countries, more companies in more countries are more forthcoming. Political contribution. Again, this question comes from the TI methodology, so it's put there. Maybe in some countries, there's already certain law that prevents political party from getting contributions. So it's maybe like moot point, but even that, for some of the countries, even where their regulation covering political donation is not quite disclosed. So I'm not so sure how we can address this. Maybe even if something is in the law, at least just state it, it's good. And then the other thing is whistleblowing channel. This is something very, very good news. Again, many of them are topping near 100%, have good policies on reporting channel that allows for confidentiality and in some case even anonymity. Okay, and then about those who raise concern whether there's a risk of reprisal. Okay, very, very good, very high. Regular monitoring, on the average, quite good, except for maybe some countries. Okay, and then I think that's about all the context I want to set for the panel. There are many, many specific issues regarding individual jurisdiction, countries of the companies of the country, but maybe I would say maybe in the panel discussion, let's move away from the country level and look at the thematic issues more closely that are independent of countries. I think that this will be something that would be a very, very good learning experience, even though Malaysia and Thailand, I would say upfront, they are more disciplined in terms of the disclosure. There's something we can learn from them, but I would say that for anti-corruption, business integrity, never take things for granted. When in doubt, disclose, disclose, disclose. With that, thank you so much for your attention.